Hello and welcome once again to On the Mic with Mike. I am Mike Jarvis, and joining me today is Mr. Benito Wheatley from the British Virgin Islands. Mr. Wheatley is the BVI Special Envoy. I'll get him to explain what all of that entails. Thanks for coming on the program, Mr. Wheatley. Give us a bit of a background as to your posting within the British Virgin Islands government to begin with.
Well, firstly, a pleasure to join you today, Mike. Yes, I am the special envoy of the Premier of the British Virgin Islands. It's a diplomatic and representational role. I primarily handle UN matters as the BVI's UN representative in Latin America and the Caribbean, but I am also the BVI's CARICOM ambassador, OECS ambassador, and Association of Caribbean States ambassador. And I also work very closely with the Premier on UK issues.
Okay, and we know that you at one point were the BVI representative in the United Kingdom. Now, we are going to focus principally on matters pertaining to the overseas territories, certainly British Virgin Islands, but UK overseas territories relationship. We're doing that on the day that, this recording at least, when we've had the King's speech outlining the policies of the new Labour government, the first Labour government in the UK since, well, at least for the past 14 years. Let us begin there. What are your expectations going forward with the relationship between the UK and the overseas territories with this new government in place?
Well, firstly, you'll notice that in the King's speech, there was no reference to the overseas territories. And that is because Labour will have to take the time to consider the direction of travel it would like to go with the overseas territories over the course of this parliament. What we in the overseas territories really want is to re-establish a modern partnership with the UK. 14 years of Conservative Party rule severely strained the relationship. So we now have to get back on track to building a relationship that is not colonial in nature, but one that is balanced and fair and respects the interests of the people of the overseas territories and also that of the UK. A balanced modern partnership.
Now, I know that you said what we in the overseas territories, encompassing all of the OTs and not just focusing on the British Virgin Islands from your perspective. Now, rather than simply asking, are you speaking on behalf of all of the overseas territories, let me put it this way. To what extent is the perspective of the overseas territories united on how the relationship is with the UK government at the moment, or with the UK broadly as a moment?
Well, you may recall that at the tail end of the previous British government, there was an attempt to engage the overseas territories on reframing the relationship. During that process, there was quite a bit of consultation that was done between the overseas territories themselves as well as with the UK. So we have identified a number of common positions. We all want to see climate change addressed. We are mostly small islands, low-lying coastal communities, and we need UK support to respond to the climate crisis. We have rising sea levels. In the Caribbean, we have more severe and powerful and frequent storms. The Hurricane Beryl just passed through the Caribbean just a few weeks ago and nearly hit the Cayman Islands. So it's very important that we collaborate and cooperate with the UK as partners in responding to the climate crisis. Sustainable development is another one. Sustainable development is not just an ideal for independent countries, particularly those in the developing world. It's an aspiration for all societies. So we all should be striving to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, which we hope to do by 2030. May take a bit more time, but we are still going to strive toward that. The UK should be working with us in that regard. And then, of course, we have the issue of security. particularly for those of us in the Caribbean, but even farther afield in the Pacific. There's a lot of illegal activity that happens in wide open ocean spaces in the Caribbean and the Pacific. So we need the UK to be present. You have organized crime doing people trafficking, you have drug trafficking, and we need more support in that regard. And finally, and very importantly, what we want is not to have UK impositions on us. We want our parliaments and our governments to be respected. And in that regard, we want the UK to consult us when it comes to matters of interest or concern to them, and not to just make decisions and for us and force them upon us. We do not want that. That is not a modern partnership. That is colonialism. So that's that, Mike, in a nutshell. That's what I would say collectively the overseas territories want.
Well, that's not even quite a nutshell. That is quite detailed, and that, it's very instructive to hear that. The last point there, they're all important points, particularly the last point on the nature of the relationship. We have heard practically from all the overseas territories that the relationship tends to be too top down. You mentioned the word, imposition, having decisions imposed on the overseas territories from London. The point that you made about what the previous Conservative government, the new format for the relationship they came up with towards the end of last year, also at the tail end of their recent period in government. What out of that do you think the current Labour government can take forward that the overseas territories themselves might agree with? And I'm going to just load it up by asking how much of an input did the overseas territories have in that?
Look, we had substantial input. A joint declaration was signed between the UK and the overseas territories. That joint declaration went to the various cabinets of the governments of the overseas territories. It was approved, and it has some very good things in there. For example, there is a section that speaks about greater autonomy, the UK supporting greater autonomy. Not just that, the UK supporting those overseas territories who want to have a closer relationship within their region, like the Caribbean territories that are a part of CARICOM and OECS. So my view is that the Labour government, as they should review what was done, but not sweep it away. What I think they could do is, if they feel it necessary to align with their policies, add to what is there, which may require further consultations. But we should build upon the good work that was done prior.
Two principal issues under one general heading, that of financial services, which a lot, if not most, of the overseas territories rely on heavily for the economy, have to do with issues that came up during the last UK election campaign, and they were strong on the political platforms by practically all of the parties. Non-doms, the non-domiciled British folks who are living elsewhere, and in many instances, particularly the overseas territories, and the matter of the beneficial ownership scheme. Now, I could go into detail and speak to those in terms of explaining them, but why don't I get you to explain them and tell us how you see those issues impacting on the overseas territories as far as a UK policy perspective goes?
Well, Mike, among those issues you raised, the most relevant for the overseas territories is public registers of beneficial ownership. The non-doms issue is more of a UK-centric matter dealing with British citizens and their tax status and what they can claim. But the issue for the overseas territories is that the UK government and Parliament in the last British government wanted to impose public registers of beneficial ownership on the territories. What does this mean? It means that in territories such as the BVI, Cayman, Bermuda, Anguilla that host financial centers, company incorporation is a major part of the business model. It is the product, one of the main products that is offered. You can incorporate a company in one of these jurisdictions, and it could be used globally for business purposes. What some UK parliamentarians wanted and was being pushed by the UK government was that the beneficial owners of these companies, that their details, their name, their address should be publicly available so that journalists and anyone else can access that information. Now, the overseas territories were not happy about that because we follow the standards set by the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global standard setting body when it comes to beneficial ownership. And there is no global standard that says that everyone should adopt public registers. So essentially, the UK would be pushing us and us alone to do so. And the impact of that is that the business would leave the BVI, Cayman and Bermuda and Anguilla, and go elsewhere where those requirements are not in place. So as you may know, the BVI's budget, our revenue stream, 65% of our revenue comes from financial services. So if we were to take the steps that the UK government wanted us to in the last parliament, essentially it could have had a deleterious effect on our revenue stream, which means the government wouldn't be able to pay for public services like education, like healthcare, security. They wouldn't be able to fix roads and things of that nature when it comes to public infrastructure. So we had to encourage the UK government to take a more pragmatic approach. Now, in 2016, we agreed with the UK government that UK law enforcement could have access to any information that they request on beneficial owners for the purpose of investigations. We are partners in the fight against illicit finance and economic crime. So we partnered with them on that, and we have no issue whatsoever with law enforcement having that access. But you have those who want to go further. An important development happened in 2022, which was that the European Court of Justice ruled in that within the EU, public registers could not be forced on any state. The BVI had aligned itself with the EU on this because they were moving ahead as a global standard setters. Now, with this blow to the EU, where they no longer will pursue this as an international standard at the moment, it means that the BVI and other overseas territories will be left alone to do this, which again, as I mentioned, could have a terrible impact on our financial services sectors because the business would go elsewhere. So we have to work with the UK government on a pragmatic basis to ensure that we are partnering, cooperating in the fight against illicit finance, but not destroying these vital industries that have made these territories very economically successful.
How does London, the financial district, the globally regarded financial district of London, figure in all of this? Is it a case, as in some of the comments that I've been hearing and reading, as it's basically one rule for London and another rule for the overseas territories, particularly with financial service centers?
Yeah, well, the UK government itself did adopt a public register. It's housed at Company House. And the UK, of course, has a large financial services industry. A lot of the business that they engage in is via trusts at this point. And those trusts are not public. They are not. The bulk of the business that we do in the overseas territories, and in particular BVI, they are companies, holding companies that are used largely for legitimate purposes. Now, just to be clear, I'll repeat this one more time. We do not have a problem with sharing beneficial ownership information with law enforcement. There is no issue. We have even gone a step further as overseas territories. We've agreed with the UK that information on beneficial owners can be accessed by persons or institutions with a legitimate interest, because that is also what the EU is doing. So London has to be cleaned up where there are problems, and I think the previous government and the incoming government now are going to do that. No one has an interest in seeing corruption in any way flourish. We want to clamp down on it. So we have to be partners, the UK, the overseas territories, and the Crown dependencies that also have financial services industries. We all have to partner in that process and work with international global institutions, the OECD, the Financial Action Task Force as well, to ensure that we have a joined up approach to how we address the issue of illicit finance, economic crime, and corruption more widely.
And that phrase you used, partnership, we have to partner, it is absolutely significant. But realistically, are we looking more at a paternalistic type of relationship as opposed to having a partnership, given the sheer nature of the constitutional relationship between the UK and the overseas territories?
Well, Mike, this is one of the things that we raised last year with the British government when we were consulting on the joint declaration. The current status of overseas territory was never meant under international law to be a permanent status. It's supposed to be a preparatory status in a way that helps us to get to a point where we can make a decision on our political future. And that political future would involve choosing one of the three political statuses sanctioned by the UN. One, that could be independence. Two, it could be a free association between an overseas territory and another state, which could be the UK. And in that relationship, both sides are internally sovereign, but they have a partnership on things like defense and other areas. The Cook Islands and New Zealand are a model of that. And then finally, of course, integration. If a territory would like to integrate into the UK, that would be an option as well. But in that situation, you cannot set your own tax policy. You have to align everything with UK laws. So if we want to get away from the colonial underpinnings of the relationship, we have to get territories to the point where they can make a decision on a new political status that would wipe away this inequality that we're talking about.
But haven't the Crown dependencies effectively done that? And Crown dependencies as opposed to the overseas territories, but haven't they effectively done that? And if so, why haven't the overseas territories done that?
Yeah, so it's in the case of the Crown dependencies, they say that their relationship is a historical relationship with the monarchy, with the Crown, that they have always had their own parliament and made decisions for themselves. So in the current setup with the UK, they maintain that position, and the UK makes decisions for them with and only with their consent. Which is why when it came to public registers, the UK government couldn't, and the UK Parliament could not force or impose them upon the Crown dependencies, although the Crown dependencies are doing the same business as the overseas territories. Now, the overseas territories status is one that should change. Now, why hasn't it changed? Well, for one thing, the territories have to push themselves to want to make a change. But then on this UK side, there are some within the UK, not everyone, but some, who believe that the underlying colonial relationship gives them the tools they need to control the territories. And that is a problem, because it is not, those individuals do not view the people of the territories with the same respect that they regard in which they have crown dependencies, right? And so that is a problem. There is a democratic deficit between the overseas territories and the UK, but there is no such deficit between the crown dependencies and the UK. And we have to get a change of mindset within the FCDO, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, that sees us, the people of the overseas territories, in a different light. People that are deserving of going forward on the basis of equality in the relationship with the UK. We have to wipe out that democratic deficit and set the territories in a path where they can have equality with the UK in the relationship.
How much, though, does the onus fall on in this case, the overseas territories themselves? And for folks listening who might just wish to get a distinction between the overseas territories and the crown dependencies would be Jersey, Guernsey, Isle of Man, those parts of the British Isles. But how much of an onus does it place on the overseas territories themselves to initiate resetting the relationship? We hear that phrase coming up ever so often, resetting the relationship. But more often than not, it is coming from the UK.
Well, the UK recognized, at least the previous government did, that they had made some bad errors, and that a large part of the fault for the fraying and fracturing of the relationship was their ill-advised decisions regarding the territories, heavy-handed tactics toward the territories. So the minister, the former Overseas Territories Minister, David Wheatley, was trying to fix it, trying to reframe it, the relationship, to make it better. So we, unfortunately ended up having this done at the very tail end of the previous government. And the previous government was supposed to issue a new overseas territories strategy for the UK. But the clock ran out on ministers. So what we are hoping is that this process will resume under the current government. And the territories have already written to the new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, to ask that a joint ministerial council meeting between the UK and the overseas territories take place this year, hopefully in October and November, so that we can get back on track to putting in place a new framework for the relationship, and the UK having a strategy in which they have properly consulted the territories and internally consulted among themselves, so that we can have a balanced relationship going forward in which there's less friction, less tension.
The overseas territories they span the globe, but for the purposes of this conversation, at this juncture of the conversation, I want to just zero in on the Caribbean overseas territories in the context that the new foreign minister who presides over the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office is Mr. David Lammy, who is of Caribbean background, is Guyanese. Does that make you any more hopeful? And someone can argue, well, the previous foreign secretary was from Africa of Sierra Leonean background, but whatever that connection is, however that one panned out.
Yeah, well, we know that the new foreign secretary, David Lammy, has an affinity for the Caribbean. And one of his first actions on becoming foreign secretary was he engaged with the Caribbean countries affected by Hurricane Beryl. So Grenada and St. Vincent in particular. But not just that. The foreign secretary reached out to the Cayman Islands. That was also in Beryl's path. Thank God they were not affected. So the strong signals from the foreign secretary are that he is interested in the Caribbean and will be a friend. And in addition to that, if we look at his previous statements in the Commons, we look at some of the policy positions he's expressed on behalf of labor, he understands the problematic nature of Britain's colonial past. He gets it. He understands it very clearly. He understands the Windrush issues. So he is someone that we are hoping that as he looks at policy toward the Caribbean and the overseas territories located in that region, that he will guide Britain in a way where the policies are favorable to partnership with the Caribbean and the territories there. One of the things that we would welcome is his support and encouragement of closer relations and cooperation by the Caribbean overseas territories in CARICOM, OECS, and the Association of Caribbean States. It's a good thing for us to be more closely aligned and engaged with our neighbors. We share many common issues, and right now there's a very active hurricane season. Any one of us could be hit in the months ahead, God forbid, but we will have to rely on our neighbors, because that's what happened in 2017 when the BVI was hit by Hurricanes Irma and Maria. The region came to our aid and worked with the UK on assisting us in the immediate aftermath of the storm.
You know, one of the things that intrigues me about and I'm still focusing on the Caribbean overseas territories, and given that you just mentioned CARICOM and the OECS, here we have a situation, and it comes back to the point of, are the particularly Caribbean overseas territories, which have so much in common historically, geographically, even politically, probably even more so than the other overseas territories. But here we have a situation where I think the only full member of CARICOM and the OECS is Montserrat, which is in a situation of being dependent on UK aid at the moment, unlike its other Caribbean overseas territories. I think the BVI and Anguilla are associate members. Is there a point to be made for more of a oneness, to use that term, a joint approach among the OEC, the overseas territories, within their own scope geographically and politically, as well as speaking with one voice to the British government?
Well, yes, and we do that. We have.
Do we do it enough, though?
Well, we can do it more, certainly, but we've been doing it pretty frequently because of the various challenges and issues that have arisen. We have the Caribbean Overseas Territories Caucus that consists of Anguilla, Bermuda, BVI, Cayman, Montserrat, and Turks and Caicos. And we come together whenever necessary, but also whenever there is a CARICOM heads of government meeting, in the margins of those meetings, we try to meet as well to discuss our common positions. So we were fortunate that just last year at that very same, in Port of Spain at the 50th anniversary celebration of CARICOM, we were able to have a initial meeting with the UK Overseas Territories Minister there, and which was fantastic. And he listened to our interests as a bloc, our interests in the region, our interests within CARICOM. And that is the kind of thing that would be very welcome. Perhaps your listeners, they may not know, but typically or usually the UK is present for some aspect of the CARICOM heads of government meeting. Yeah. And it will be, I think, very good for the Foreign Secretary to continue with that trend of dispatching a minister to attend. And as long as that is happening, we will be on the ground at those meetings at the same time, and we can robustly engage the UK government on those regional issues at that time. And of course, more frequently as required. But we do work closely together as overseas territories in the Caribbean. We work together through our CARICOM associate membership. We also work together through our associate membership in OECS, and that is Anguilla, Montserrat, and BVI. And we work together through ACS. So whenever it's necessary, we will come together, and we've been doing that.
I don't want to veer off topic. I know we're speaking about principally relationship between the overseas territories and the UK, but just on the point of the Caribbean overseas territories, the point you made there, the very valid point of at the leadership level, the OECS the overseas territories leaders coming together. Are we seeing enough of that with the people, the citizens of the overseas territories? Do we know, okay, in the Leeward Islands, in Montserrat, British Virgin Islands, Anguilla, we know one another quite well. You put Bermuda, Turks and Caymans into the picture, and it's almost as if we hardly know one another.
Look, we need much, much more people-to-people contact. Now, as you said, in the Leeward Islands, we're fortunate in that the proximity of Anguilla, Montserrat, and BVI to each other is very close. I mean, we can get in a plane and be there in about 45 minutes to an hour without a problem. Also, there are very strong family ties. There are many people in BVI and Anguilla that have strong family ties and links. Similarly, Montserrat in some cases. So in that cluster, that's those OECS associate members, we have good linkages. But I will say this, we need much, much, much more people-to-people contact between these territories. And that's for a number of reasons. One, so we can be more familiar with each other. We have many things in common, and it just makes sense from a historical perspective, solidarity perspective. But there are things that are being done in some territories that are good practice that we can learn from each other. There's also the investment. We should see each other as investment destinations, investment opportunities, right? We can have businesses in each other's territories if possible. I think there's a strong case for us to have more youth engagement. Many of us have institutions of higher education. We should be having exchanges, but even at the secondary level. And that will build and strengthen the bonds between us as overseas territories. And we'll be able to better rely on each other for things that we need, as opposed to trying to run to others, the UK directly, for things that we can provide to each other instead.
Well said. So it starts at home then. So back to the point on which we started this conversation, the relationship between the overseas territories, broadly speaking, and the UK, a new government in place, a new foreign secretary, in the case of the Caribbean, someone from Caribbean background. Are you encouraged? More than you might have been before?
I am hopeful because I think that the Labour government wants to distinguish itself from the previous Conservative Party government. I think they want to be a partner and a friend to the overseas territories. And I hope they follow through on it. This is not to say that they aren't going to be critics in the new parliament of the overseas territories. They always have been. But with the Prime Minister Keir Starmer being a center-left Prime Minister, I hope he will be pragmatic and open. And I'm encouraged because David Lammy, as you've mentioned, is a foreign secretary with Caribbean background. And I think he would have sympathy and affinity for the Caribbean territories. And then, of course, the Overseas Territories Minister would be Mr. Stephen Doughty. And he has been very engaged over the course of being a shadow minister. He's been very engaged with the overseas territories and what they need. And the UK has an interest. They have an interest in supporting us on issues like climate change. If the UK wants to be a leader in addressing climate change issues, they must begin with the overseas territories. You cannot say that you are a leader in that area and you provide assistance and support to independent countries in the same region, like the Caribbean or the Pacific, and you don't do so for your overseas territories in the same regions that we're speaking of. So there's a big opportunity, and the UK and territories can take advantage of it to build that modern partnership that can take us forward in the 21st century.
Mr. Benito Wheatley, Special Envoy to the British Virgin Islands government, thank you very much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.